So let's talk about this week. What happened this week? Before we really jump into opinions or sides of emotions, I just really want to slow down the week a bit, because there's a lot of emotion that's involved with it. There's a lot of people who are looking at different parts of this argument and trying to have their own say about it, their own perspective, which is 100% correct. Because, I mean, if you follow the news, it really looks chaotic. There's a lot of stuff happening. We had the naval exercises. There's a lot going on about Iran. There's BRICS and the issues around BRICS. The US embassy coming up with stuff. Trump side coming up with things on the side. And then people shouting from every direction. So it was absolute chaos this week. And when everything feels loud at once, it's normally a sign that we're missing the pattern that is sitting underneath it, and or we are missing the system which is actually underneath it and that's supporting it. So tonight's not about defending anybody. It's not about attacking anybody. I will not do that. It's about understanding what actually happened and why it escalated so fast during this week. So let's start at the beginning. This week started with a naval exercise off the South African coast. On paper, that's not unusual. Countries do naval exercises all the time. We've done them before. We've done them with the US. We've done them with the EU. We have done them with Russia and with China and all those others. So that's not a disputed fact. Naval exercises are at the core about training. It's about working with different countries in the world so that you have the dynamics and are able to address things in a very understand the systems of the various countries, and able to, in a case of emergency or in a case that things do escalate, able to work with other people and work with their systems. So ships practice maneuvers. That's sailing around, up and down, going up and down, driving together, whatever. Communication drills. How do we communicate? What's the language that we use? What's the protocols that we use? Safety procedures. Well, we've got to save somebody. A ship goes down. What happens with that? Search and rescue coordination. So in these exercises, multiple aspects of those are built into the exercise so that those armies or those navies can work together. It's the same with army drills. Same kind of subjects are being covered by this. Nothing dramatic. So the important question is not why did South Africa do an exercise? The real question is, why did this one trigger so much strong reaction from the rest of the world? And here's the first thing that we really have to understand. In geopolitics, that what something is matters far less than how it has been interpreted by everybody. So intent matters, but the interpretation of what happened matters a lot more. 20 years ago, this exercise probably would have passed quietly. Nobody would have known about it. It would just be something that happened. But there was no social media pressure cooker that was boiling this thing up. No instant screenshots of ships sailing in. No global outrage cycle where everybody's getting upset and everybody's getting upset at different things. Today, everything is visible. A photo becomes a signal to the world that something is busy happening. A headline in a newspaper or on a website becomes a signal. A routine event just becomes a statement, even if no one intended it to be that way. We don't live in a world of private actions anymore. Everything that we do is public, especially what countries do, and everybody who's interesting becomes even more public. So we live in a world of public, not just only public actions, but also of public interpretation of actions. So timing also matters. And timing matters much more than people realize. This exercise happened at a moment when the world was already tense. It was planned a long time ago, so there's no question about the planning. Everybody knew that this will happen. But at the moment, shipping routes are under pressure. Wars are ongoing. Major powers are extremely nervous because they're at each other's throat, even if it's just in threats. There's elections approaching. For the US, there's a midterm election approaching, which makes people nervous. For South Africa, there's a local election that's approaching, which makes South African politicians nervous. So when something happens during tension, it gets read through that tension. It doesn't get read just for what the intention was, but it gets read by the dynamics and through the intention of what is taking place. It's like saying the same sentence in a calm room versus saying it in the middle of an argument. You can say exactly the same thing with the same tone of voice. If you walk in a room where there's a fight, it will be interpreted differently than if you walk into a room where there's nothing really busy happening. The words don't change, but the environment does. And then, of course, there's the Iran factor. And this is really important, not emotionally, but structurally. Iran is currently one of the most sensitive trigger words in global politics. It's hectic, guys. Not because South Africa suddenly changed policy. South Africa didn't change policy. But because Iran sits at the center of multiple global pressure points at once. There's security pressure points. There's sanctions pressure points. There's Middle East instability. There's human rights issues that people are crying out about. There's great power rivalry which is taking place in and around Iran. So when Iran appears anywhere near military context, reaction follows automatically. It cannot be avoided. That doesn't mean that South Africa endorsed anything. It means other countries recalculated what they were seeing based on what is busy happening in the country. That distinction really, really matters. Then things became unclear. Different reports emerged. Statements were interpreted differently. Iran later stepped back and uncertainly filled the gap. Here's something that many people didn't realize. In international politics, uncertainty is often more damaging than the disagreement. Because when information isn't clear, people make up their own stories. People fill the space with emotion and with emotional statements. Fear rushes in, and that's when reactions accelerate. A lot of what we saw this week wasn't actually about ships or exercises. It was about anxiety. It was about fear of isolation. It was about fear of sanctions. It was about fear of economic consequences. It was about fear of being forced to choose sides, the one way or the other. The naval exercise became a container for so much deeper worries that people already had. That's why the reaction felt so big compared to the event itself. So this week didn't start because South Africa did something dangerous or outrageous. It started because the world is tense. Signals are sensitive, and middle countries like South Africa are under a microscope. Nothing exploded, but pressure did become visible. And once pressure becomes visible, reactions follows from various countries and individuals. That's when the story moved from the ocean into diplomacy. And to understand that, we need to zoom out a little bit, because this isn't just about South Africa. It's about the kind of world that we are living in right now. So to understand why reactions came so quickly, we need to talk about something much bigger, why the world is rearming. So the next section, part 2, why the world is rearming. Now, to understand why reactions came so quickly this week, we need to zoom out a little bit. Because what happened off our coast didn't land in calm waters or in a calm world. It landed in a world that's already on edge. And one of the clearest signs of that is something we're seeing everywhere. The world is busy rearming. Now, when people hear the world rearming, they immediately think war. Tanks rolling, missiles firing, conflict around the corner. That's not what this phase is about. This isn't about countries preparing for war. It's about countries preparing for uncertainty. Because when there is uncertainty, you can rather be ready for what might be the worst case scenario than be caught, I nearly said with your proverbial pants down, but okay. That's an important difference. For about 30 years after the Cold War, most countries reduced their defense spending. The thinking was very simple. Trade would bind us all together in one big happy family around the world. Globalization would stabilize politics. If everyone depended on each other's economically, the war would become too expensive and would become unnecessary because you can sort out things around a discussion table. And for a long time, that logic did work. Shipping lanes were predictable. There was no closing of the Suez Canal. Supply chains were reliable. Supply chains started expanding. You could manufacture this part in China, this part in Indonesia, that part in Holland, and you can bring it all together in the US, and you actually had a component or a part. major powers didn't confront each other directly. They stopped shouting at each other and started talking to each other. The world created a sense of calm. Many people grew up in that period and assumed that that is normal, because what you grow up with is assumed to be normal. But the calm was built on a lot of assumptions. And those assumptions are now being tested by what's happening at the moment in the world. Now, over the past few years, we've seen shock after shock. A major land war in Europe, unbelievable. Conflict in the Middle East, okay, that was not unbelievable, that's been going on for a long time. Disruption of shipping lanes, cyber attacks, supply chains breaking down. None of these on their own caused rearmament, but together they changed behavior of countries. Countries don't rearm because of one threat. They rearm when uncertainty starts stacking up. When leaders can no longer say, we know what next year is going to look like. And rearmament today doesn't always look dramatic. It's not just about buying weapons, it's about stockpiling fuel. It's about protecting ports. It's about securing undersea cables. It's about improving cyber defenses. It's about ensuring navies can operate safely. A lot of money is being spent simply to make sure countries aren't caught off guard. Preparedness, not aggression. That is the mindset. We've seen this across the world. Germany reversed defense restraints after years of actually scaling down on the expenditure. Japan increased military spending after generations of cautions. They even had to change their constitution in order to be able to do what they are busy with now. European countries are rebuilding ammunition reserves. Even traditionally neutral states like Switzerland are starting to reassess what neutrality really requires. That tells us that something important. It isn't ideological. It's behavioral. Countries with very different politics are reacting in similar ways because uncertainty affects everyone. Here's the part that matters for South Africa. We might say, but we're not rearming. And that's true. But we don't live outside the system. When global uncertainty rises, it changes how risk is priced everywhere. If I'm saying how risk is priced, it means that risk actually has a cost that's associated with it. Shipping insurance becomes more expensive because you have a higher risk that the cargo will not reach its port. Trade routes are reassessed. Investors become really cautious. Currencies become sensitive for fluctuations and for changes that's taking place in the world. It shows up really early. There's another thing that's changed, and that is visibility. Military movement today is no longer quiet. Ships are tracked online. On my mobile phone, I have a ship tracking system. It's because I live by the coast, but I want to know where that big container ship is that's out there. But it's really useful. Flights are visible. You can go and see where any flight is in the world today. Photos are circulated instantly. You guys can take a photo of me and it'll be reach around the world immediately within seconds. It's a screenshot. And in a nervous system, even small signals get amplified by what's busy happening. That's the environment that we're operating in. So when South Africa appears in a military context, even a routine one, it's read through a global lens. Not because we are powerful, but because the system is sensitive. When the world is hedging, it becomes less tolerant of ambiguity. And ambiguity is a word that we'll talk about a little bit more because this is really critical. This matters. So rearmament isn't about war tomorrow. It's about countries preparing for a future that they don't fully trust yet. And when trust drops, reaction time speeds up. That's why this week moved so quickly from a naval exercise to a diplomatic crisis, because the world isn't calm at the moment. It's cautious, and caution changes everything. So to really understand why this caution exists, we have to go back to when the wall fell in 1991 and the world tried to become one system. To understand why the world feels so tense right now, we need to go back. Not to last year, not even to the pandemic, but to the moment that the wall fell in 1991. When the Berlin Wall came down, something much bigger happened than just the end of the Cold War. The world didn't split again. It merged. The first time in history, the global system tried to become one system, one market, one financial system, one trading network, one supply chain. East and West didn't just stop fighting. They started doing business with each other. And for a while, it felt like history had ended. No more big ideological battles. No more clear enemies. No more blocks facing each other from one side of the globe to the other side of the globe. Just growth. Countries that had been opponents became partners. Factories moved. Capital flowed between countries. Technology spread to the whole world. China opened up its economy. That was a big one. Eastern Europe integrated into global markets. Russia joined global markets. The assumption was simple. If everyone is economically connected, nobody will risk breaking the system. So it was thought to be a self-balancing system. Trade would replace tanks. Money would replace missiles. That was the theory. And for a long time, for nearly 30 years, it actually worked. People forget that. Global poverty dropped. Supply chains became efficient across the world. Consumer goods became cheaper. The Apple that I'm recording this thing on cost a fraction of what a computer with similar power cost 10 years ago. Travel expanded. People travel all over the world, from all kinds of countries, from China, from South Africa, to South Africa, whatever the case might be. The world became very, very deeply interdependent. So deep, in fact, that a disruption in one place could affect prices everywhere else. If something went wrong in one place, the markets would react to that. And that's the price of integration. But integration came with a hidden flaw. It assumed that economic integration would automatically produce political alignment, that people who traded together would eventually think alike. That didn't happen. Instead, the world became economically connected, but politically fragmented. Countries shared supply chains, but they did not share values. Shared market, but no trust. And here's where things get really confusing for people today. We still use old labels. We still talk about the East. We still talk about the West. We still talk about the conflict between capitalism and communism. But those labels don't mean what they used to anymore. Russia today is not the Soviet Union. The USSR was a multinational ideological system. Russia today is a nation state that's pursuing its own interest. Different structure, different motivations, and different constraints from the time of the USSR. China today is not the China of Mao. It's not a closed communist economy. It's one of the most capitalist production systems the world has ever seen, just under the control of the state. Private companies, global exports, financial leverage, nice SUVs that land up in South Africa. Authoritarian politics with capitalist economies. That combination didn't exist before the Cold War. At the same time, the West also changed. Western countries outsourced manufacturing. They became dependent on a global supply chain. They shifted towards services and finances, while the manufacturing they gave over to China and other countries around the world. So nobody emerged unchanged. Everyone adapted. But adaptation does not mean that those countries converged. It meant that those countries coexist. What we ended up was not a divided world, but an entangled world. Countries are competing while relying on each other. Rivals are trading daily. Adversaries are sharing shipping lanes. Competitors are using the same technology. That's never existed before at this scale. And this is where the pressure builds, because integration creates vulnerability. If you rely on someone for your energy, your food, your chips, your shipping routes, disagreements become really, really dangerous. Not militarily, economically. So countries started asking a few questions, not who is the enemy, but who am I too dependent on? And that question changes everything. This is the world that we are in now. Not Cold War clarity, but integrated tension. No clear sides, no clean separations, just overlapping interest, layered risk, and very, very fragile trust. And this is why some people feel nostalgic for the old days. Back then, enemies were clear. You knew that if you were supporting a specific ideology, who your enemy was. And people tried to reach back to that and find the same enemies and friends that they had in the days when the line between enemies was clear. Proxy wars had structure. There was a war on in Angola. That war was fed on the one side by the East and on the other side by the West, and it was financed by them as well. Today we can trade with somebody in the morning and sanction them in the afternoon. That uncertainty is really exhausting for governments, and for citizens it's even worse. So when something big happens, a naval exercise, a statement, a headline, it doesn't land in a simple world anymore, where everything touches everything else. And that's why reaction today feels faster, sharper, and more emotional, because the system itself is stretched. So, when countries talk about non-alignment and new groupings like BRICS, they're responding to this world, not the Cold War that we remember. And this is really important. So let's talk about part 4, non-alignment and BRICS in today's world. So once the world integrated like this, economically connected but politically tense, countries had to start asking new questions. Not who are we allied to like it was before 1991, but how do we survive in a world where everyone is connected and nobody fully agrees with each other? That's where non-alignment comes back into the conversation, but not in the way that people think. Non-alignment was born during the Cold War. Back then, it made perfect sense. You had two clear blocks, the US and its allies on the one side, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other side. If you were a newly independent country, choosing either side could cost you your sovereignty. So non-alignment meant we don't join your military alliance and we don't join theirs, which is a safe space. It was about staying out of the great power conflict. That was the original idea anyway. But here's the problem. That world no longer exists. There are no two neat blocks anymore. There is no single East. There is no single West. There are overlapping interests, shifting partnerships, and constant negotiation. So non-alignment today can't mean standing apart from each other, because nobody stands apart anymore. In today's world, non-alignment doesn't mean distance, it means balance. It means trading with many partners. It means talking to many countries. But balance is much, much harder than neutrality, because balance requires constant signaling. It needs constant chatter. It needs constant discussion. It needs constant negotiation. And it keeps on saying, well, we have this little misunderstanding, so let's clarify this quickly. This is where BRICS enters the picture. So BRICS is often misunderstood. It's not a military alliance. It's not the old East Bloc. It is not the global South. That's not what BRICS is. It's not a military alliance. It does not have a mutual defense clause like NATO. It has no shared foreign policy. Everybody have their own foreign policy. If one BRICS country goes to war, the others are not obliged to support it at all. That's important. BRICS is a cooperation forum, mainly focused on trade, development finance, alternative institutions, and political coordination. It offers options. It does not offer protection. So, joining BRICS doesn't replace the global system. It doesn't replace the dollar overnight. It doesn't replace Western trade. It doesn't cancel existing relationships. It simply adds another layer. And many countries belong to multiple groupings at the same time. South Africa does this constantly. That is normal diplomacy. The challenge is, like we said earlier, perception. In a sensitive global environment, participation can be interpreted as alignment, even when it isn't. And that's where the tension begins. Because non-alignment relies very heavily on how others read your actions, how others perceive you, not just what you intend. You cannot believe, you can believe that you're balancing while others think that you are leaning in a way. That gap is really, really dangerous. And this is where timing matters again. When the global system is calm, ambiguity is tolerated. When the system is tense, ambiguity becomes suspicious. That's not moral judgment, it's just human behavior. When people are nervous, they want clarity. And non-alignment by its very nature is not clear-cut. So, countries like South Africa walk a very, very narrow line. They want to be strategically independent. They want diversified partnerships because it creates a more robust trading environment. They want freedom of maneuver. They want to be able to change their mind and do things, but they also depend on trade access, on investor confidence. It depends on diplomatic trust between countries. Those two goals can collide. This is why people shouting, choose a side, are missing the point. Choosing a side reduces your options as a country, but refusing to manage perception increases the risk even more. Non-alignment today is not about ideology. It's about calibration, tone, timing, consistency. Those things matter more than ever before. So, BRICS, non-alignment, and South Africa's positioning are not signs of rebellion. They are signs of a middle country trying to navigate an incredibly complex system. Sometimes we do it well. Sometimes we do it clumsily. But we are always under scrutiny. And that sets the stage for what happens next, because once perception starts to shift, responses follow. And this week, we saw exactly that. So when the US response came, it did not come out of nowhere. It came into a system that's already on edge. So why did the US response escalate? That's my part 5. Now, this is where the temperature changes this week, or changed this week, because until this point, everything we've spoken about sits in the background. It's framework, it's stuff that's happening on the back end, and it just explains why the system works the way that it works. Global tension, rearmament, non-alignment, perception. But then the United States responded, not quietly, not in the background, not by giving somebody a call, but publicly. And that's when people started getting nervous. The US Embassy in Pretoria released a statement that was unusually strong. No, not emotional, but very direct. It used words like concern, alarm, and undermines stability. It mentioned Iran by name. It questioned whether certain actions could still be described as non-alignment. That's not routine diplomatic language, and it wasn't accidental. In diplomacy, words are chosen very carefully. When language becomes firm, it is not because somebody lost their temper. Diplomacy does not lose its temper. It is because a very clear message is being sent. Public diplomacy is pressure, not punishment. It's just something completely different from punishment. And that distinction is really, really important. It's not sanctions. It wasn't a break in relations. It was not a declaration of hostility. It was a signal, a very loud signal, but it was a signal. Signals are used when private conversations haven't fully settled the concerns that there are between countries. They're also used when countries want their position to be cleared on record, not just when the government is involved, but with the wider international community as well. And that's really important because diplomacy today doesn't happen behind closed doors anymore. A lot of it happens in public view, but it happens for subtle pressures. And that's a complete discussion in its own right, and it has to do with how negotiations take place. One of the key things in diplomacy is that countries should not lose face. Now, when a public diplomatic statement is made, it steps beyond the place where we talk quietly behind closed doors and we try to get peace. They speak internally to voters and externally to other countries. So this is the problem. Governments no longer speaks to just one audience. So we have heard these public statements made by our president to its voters. There are public statements made to its allies. There are public statements made to large countries like the US. But those countries hear all of them. The internet collapsed those audiences into one. Before, you could actually sit in a room and you could talk to each other and nobody else would know about it. So what's said for domestic reassurance is heard internationally as policy tone. What sounds strong at home can sound incredibly confrontational abroad, even if it was not the intention. This is one of the toughest challenges of modern diplomacy, is that anything that you are saying to a crowd in Khayelitsha will be heard and echo around the world. And if you're not careful with what you are saying, that can send the wrong message to the rest of the world. So consistency matters. Other countries don't judge sincerity by emotion. They judge it by alignment. In public language and private negotiation, that doesn't sound the same. When they are not equal, uncertainty grows. So if the public voice of, I'm just using the example of our president, if the public voice of our president is different from the diplomatic voice that's happening on the back end, then other countries start thinking, oh, this is a different signal from what we heard before. It does not lead to anger, especially initially. It leads to uncertainty, and uncertainty erodes trust much faster than disagreement. Then another piece of news dropped this week, quieter but significant, and this is an important factor. The FBI announced a counterintelligence action involving a South African private company accused of exporting US-controlled military training technology to China without authorization. Now, this is hectic, guys. This is important to state clearly. This was not an accusation against the South African government, and it also did not involve the SANDF. It was a legal process involving private actors. But here's the reality. In security thinking, events are not viewed in isolation. They are read together. When security agencies start speaking in public, the tone shifts, because diplomacy starts looking awfully much like intent. Security agencies look at risk. And when perceived risk increases, tolerance decreases. That's how these systems work. At the same time, we saw a strong public message from the US political sphere, statements about Iran, talks of tariffs on countries trading with Iran, like South Africa, public moral framing around repression and human rights. These were not formal policy documents yet, but they were signals. And signals matter, especially when they stack up. Economic pressure, security language, diplomatic criticism. Individually, they are manageable, but together, they form a perceived posture. This is why the word Iran became such a big trigger this week. Not because South Africa suddenly changed its policy, but because Iran currently sits at the intersection of security anxiety, of sanction regimes, of regional instability, and moral framing. Anything connected to it becomes very, very sensitive. So this week wasn't about one naval exercise. It was about accumulation of events. It was about perception forming, signals lining up. And once that happens, reactions accelerate. Now, and this is important, None of this means that South Africa is isolated. It doesn't mean that sanctions are coming tomorrow. It does not mean that trade is collapsing. But it does mean that the relationship entered a much more delicate phase. The margin for misunderstanding has become extremely narrow. And middle countries, like South Africa, feels that narrowing very quickly, and a lot quicker than large countries. This isn't about panic. And it's not about pretending that nothing changed. It's about recognizing that the tone shifted, and tone matters in diplomacy, especially when trust is already thin. And that brings us to something incredibly important, the role of leadership styles in moments like this, and how one particular actor is shaping the system. So, part 6, Trump as an actor in the system. To understand why this week felt so intense, we also need to understand something else. It's not policies. It's not ideology, but leadership style. Because systems don't respond to events, they respond to how power is exercised. And right now, one of the most influential styles in the system is Donald Trump's. Whether people like him or not, he changes the temperature. Trump doesn't operate like a traditional diplomat. He doesn't lead through careful ambiguity. He leads through leverage. He leads like it's a business. Pressure first, negotiation later. He believes clarity comes from confrontation, not from consensus. That doesn't make him irrational, it makes him transactional. So you can compare Cyril Ramaphosa's style with Trump's style. Trump is very confrontational, where if you go and look at Cyril Ramaphosa looks for consensus. He looks for reconciliation. He looks for talking. He really tries to do things in a very diplomatic way. So it's two clashing personalities that's dealing on the international stage. So in a transactional mindset, relationships are not symbolic. They're practical. Who gives what? Who benefits? Who carries the risk? Everything becomes measurable. And in that world, ambiguity is a problem. Being vague becomes a problem, because ambiguity cannot be costed. It cannot be priced. And this is where non-alignment struggles. Non-alignment relies on flexibility. It relies on having space. It relies on interpretation, which can be clarified. But transactional politics wants definition. You're either helping or you're not. You're either aligned or you're not. That binary logic doesn't sit comfortably in an integrated world. Trump's approach doesn't create new tensions. It just accelerates existing ones. He doesn't invent pressure points. He pushes on the ones that's already there. And that's why things move faster under his style. Less patience, less tolerance for nuance, and more public signaling. When he talks about tariffs, for example, it's not always immediately policy. Often it's leverage. A way of saying these relationships have consequences. Markets react. Governments take note. Conversations shift before any document is signed. The same applies to moral language. Public statements about values, repression, and legitimacy aren't just ethical claims. They are strategic framing. They define how actions will be interpreted going forward. Once they are framed, it's hard to reverse it. This doesn't mean that Trump controls the system. The system is much bigger than any person. But leadership style does determine speed. Under cautious leadership, pressure builds slowly. Under transactional leadership, pressure surfaces very, very quickly. And that's what we saw this week. And here's the key insight. In a highly integrated world, speed matters. Signals move faster than policy. Policy typically moves incredibly slow. Perceptions forms long before decisions. Reactions happens before clarity. That's not ideal, but it's real. So when we look at the events of this week, we shouldn't see chaos. We should see compression. Processes that used to take months now take days. Messages that used to stay private now go public. Interpretations that used to be negotiated now happen online. This makes life harder for middle countries like South Africa, because middle countries rely on time. time to explain, time to clarify, time to rebalance. When time shrinks, room to maneuver shrinks with it. Trump's style doesn't remove diplomacy. It compresses it. And compressed diplomacy is very, very unforgiving. There's no space for finesse. That's why small signals suddenly matters. That's why tone matters even more. That's why words get weighted so heavily. This isn't about liking or disliking anyone. It's about understanding the environment that we are operating with. And the environment is faster, sharper, and much less patient than before. So when all this lands on a country like South Africa, not small, not powerful, it explains why pressure shows up early. So we'll talk about that in part 7, when everything comes together. Why middle countries feel global shifts first, and what this week really tells us about where we stand. So, when we look back at the week, the naval exercise, the reactions, the statements, the tension, it's easy to ask, well, why us? Why does South Africa seem to feel global pressure so quickly? Why do things escalate here faster than they seem to go anywhere else? The answer isn't because we're doing anything extreme. It's because of where we sit. South Africa is not a superpower. We don't control global finance. We don't set the rules of trade. We don't project military force. But we're also not a small country that can disappear off the radar. We're connected very deeply. Trade, shipping, diplomacy. This position has a lot of advantages, but it also has its costs. Middle countries don't just manage policy. They manage perceptions. They live in the space between influence and exposure. Big powers absorb the shock. Something happens, oh well, we'll pick that up. Small countries often avoid it because they move under the radar. Middle countries like South Africa feel it early. When global confidence shifts, we feel it in the currency. The rand goes up and down as the sentiment about the rand changes. When trade risk rises, we feel it in prices. Our prices start going up. When diplomatic tone hardens, we feel it in our relationships with other countries. Not because decisions have changed, but because sentiment has. Pressure shows up long before a crisis. That's how the system works. This week wasn't about choosing a side. It wasn't about East versus West. And it wasn't about betrayal or loyalty. It was about how quickly interpretation now moves. A naval exercise becomes a signal. A statement becomes a posture. A word, Iran, became a trigger. Not because of intention, but because of timing. We also saw something else clearly. The world no longer gives middle countries the luxury of contradiction. And this is kind of key. Domestic messaging is global messaging now. What is said to voters is heard by diplomats. What's meant for reassurance at home can sound like defiance abroad. Not because anyone is acting in bad faith, but because the audiences have merged. That's the new reality. If our president stands on a podium and he says, we will not be bullied by any superpowers, it gives a different message from, we are friends with each other and we all are trying to make this thing work together. Different messages, but it's heard both. That doesn't mean that South Africa is isolated. It doesn't mean that disaster is coming. And it doesn't mean that we must panic. But it does mean awareness matters much more than ever. And our tone matters. Even our tone as individuals on the internet matters. Consistency matters. Timing matters, because trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild. There's a temptation in moments like this to swing to extremes, to say, everything is collapsing. These are our friends. We will stand with them and we'll die with them. Or to say, nothing is wrong. Like, okay, don't worry, it's not so serious, guys. But both are comforting stories for different people for different reasons, but both are incomplete. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. The system isn't collapsing, but it is tightening. And when systems tighten, space shrinks, especially for countries in the middle like South Africa. This week wasn't a verdict. It was a signal. a reminder of exactly how sensitive the world has become and how carefully middle countries now have to move within it. Understanding this doesn't mean agreeing with everyone. It doesn't mean surrendering sovereignty. It doesn't mean choosing sides. It means seeing the board clearly, because you cannot navigate a system that you do not understand. And maybe that's the real lesson of this week. Not fear, not defiance, but clarity. In a world under pressure, understanding the system is one of the few advantages that a country like ours can have. And I think it's really, really important that we as individuals in this country also have an understanding of what's really busy happening.